I'd like to welcome everybody to the meeting today. Thanks very much for coming. It's an opportunity to follow up on, let's say, another topic that's really much in line with what we've been looking at in the rapid studies by considering the digital transformation of government and various components to do with partnership and partnership working. I'm Robin Smith from the Joint Research Centre, and I'm part of the ELISE team looking after this study with colleagues from Deloitte and the Catholic University of Leuven. And ELISE is the European Location Interoperability Solutions for E-Government Action in the ISO² programme. And the work we're doing together is about knowledge transfer. And the interesting thing about the presentation today is both looking at the digital transformation aspects of the work, particularly digital transformation of government, but also to some extent knowledge transfer as well. So here our two main, let's say, leading topics in our work are coming together in one presentation. And why a rapid study? Because it's important to take stock and know where we're starting from when we're entering into new topics, and digital transformation has many aspects to it. And in this case, talking about games, gamification and serious games, we build on the presentation that Therese gave us last time, looking into participatory democracy, volunteer geographic information, and lots of the issues coming through data and citizens. Here we go even more into this, let's say, softer side of things by considering mechanisms in this context. And in some ways, Therese has not had a lot of time, but taken the opportunity to look into various aspects about games in the geospatial context. And that's definitely where we're starting from. So this is a very useful piece of work to just say, well, what does geospatial have to say about games, gamification, serious games? And it's a good baseline for us to start with. So now I'd like to quickly introduce Professor Therese Steenbergen, who is of course a professor at the Catholic University of Leuven and has been leading this work. Therese, please, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a professor at the University of Leuven in the Geography and Tourism Division, and I'm also the managing director of the Spatial Applications Division of the KU Leuven. My background is in geography and spatial planning. My current research interests are in citizen science, with an ongoing Main Tuin Lab project, aiming at skills development and capacity building in the geoinformation sector, and with Erasmus+ EU4Geo project, and another one is the future R&D needs and new developments in Copernicus services. I'm also currently working on a feasibility study of establishing a new emergency service management data center in Panama for the Caribbean zone and Central America. And of course, I need to mention this, that this presentation reflects my own opinion and it's not an official position of the Commission. It's also ongoing research, so input and opinions are certainly very much appreciated. Before we start, it's good to remember the definition of digital transformation. Digital transformation is about fundamental change to policymaking, service delivery, organizations, and also the democratization of these elements. This includes digital skills. Our project's aim is to help this democratization. And one of the ways to stimulate or to help democratization is by looking at how we can stimulate participation. The link with previous seminars is very well illustrated with this slide that comes from the role of geospatial in the digital transformation of government, which was a seminar given a year ago, approximately, May 2019. In this and in other rapid studies, different challenges were addressed, such as how to understand and deal with the concerns of external actors and trying to achieve co-creation. Our external actors are all those being part of the data ecosystem, so it's not just government. They are Inspire users and a wide variety of geospatial user communities. Aside from technology, achieving co-creation also involves a social element. And when users like technology, they are most likely to use it. So this leads us to the objective of the seminar. Starting from the definition of digital transformation and the creation of inclusive public administrations that provide high quality to citizens, business, and other stakeholders, we looked at what possibilities serious games can offer. And as definition, serious games could possibly be used to stimulate stakeholder involvement in collaboration and in service delivery. So the objective of the webinar can be summarized as what are the main issues to consider in order to maximize the benefits of gamification in the geospatial domain to stimulate the digital transformation of government. The overall setup or content of the presentation is that we answer the typical questions. First, we will have a short introduction on the topic and make sure that we all understand the key terminology that is used. And we then address the 6 key questions. Why can games help stimulate digital transformation? What elements can be stimulated through gamification? How to prepare the design and development of serious games? Who, and there we will mostly look at game mastering issues. And then where and when are dealing with situational awareness and the adaptation of games to different contexts and to different purposes. And then we will have a synthesis of the main messages and the conclusion. Now, to introduce the topic, what is a game? It may sound very straightforward, but human history indicates that games have been played in all societies. Games can be considered a specific form of playing behavior with characteristics such as rules and identifiable outcome. So, for example, just throwing pebbles in the water is playing with pebbles. It's not a game. If there is a set of rules to be obeyed and points are awarded according to these rules, then there are some quantifiable results, then it becomes a game. The picture shown here is an example of a game in the traditional Damara culture in northwest Namibia. This is a semi-arid to very arid area where we had for thousands of years these hunter-gatherer tribes, and when 2 tribes met, the chiefs would sit down and play this game, which consists of having little holes and putting, according to a set of rules, the pebbles from one hole into the other. So there was a clear set of rules. When these games were played, the winner would receive some things from the loser. This could be all type of products, but it could be as much as women, children, and a good player could even take the whole tribe from the losing other chief. So it was more than a game. It was a serious game. To understand even more what today's topic is about, I would like to show you this picture, which is a rock carving from Twijfelfontein. It's in Damaraland. It's a World Heritage Site. And you can see something that we see in many archaeological sites, carvings of animals represented in the rock. This is huge. It's an entire part of a mountain that is filled with this type of carvings. normally, when we find these artifacts, the carvings represent animals and hunting scenes. Now, in this case, I hope you can recognize the lion and the giraffe, but they are not hunting scenes. This is part of a map. So what this picture shows is a representation with the different circles indicating where there would be water wells. And the water wells or water holes were typically the places where the different tribes would meet. And around each water well, you would see which animals are there. Is it a well with crocodiles? Is it a well with lions? Is it a well with a lot of gazellas? So it's a map showing the characteristics of that environment, and even the size shows how much water there is, and the internal symbol shows if it's a seasonal well or a year-round, a permanent well. So this is where these tribes coming from all over Namibia and even beyond would come together and meet each other around these places and then play, and in some cases exchange some tribe members based on the outcome of the game. Now, years later, they have discovered from genetic research that due to the fact that there were exchanges of people among tribes, that this has really helped preventing inbreeding, because these were very small family units wandering around the desert area. So this shows that a game can be a serious game, but when you add the geospatial dimension to it, it can even become much more serious and have much further implications. Now, to step from this Damara example into what we could do for geospatial, we started with a literature review, and the first thing that was obvious is that there is a lot going on in this field. So a few keywords: a serious game, geo, gave 33 peer-reviewed publications in 2 years' time. So, and searching more broadly, there were like 608. So it was really, there is even a dedicated journal of computer game research. So there is a lot of reference materials, and there is a lot of good documentation on games. These three references are the main references that were used, because they were special issues based on conferences where there were specific articles presenting good practices in serious games developed in the geospatial domain. Now, the basic framework for developing a serious game is represented here, and we see in the center the game design methods, the concepts and principles used for serious games. They are in general very similar to those used for the development and design of entertainment games. So these concepts, technologies and principles are supported by further information and communication technologies and domain-specific methodologies and technologies with regard to the characterizing goal of the serious game. And typical ICT technologies include mechanisms such as artificial intelligence for planning, automated generation and intelligent behavior, and virtual characters, aspects of human-computer interaction, sensor technology to retrieve and monitor context information, while the domain-specific, the outer circle, include aspects such as psychosocial and pedagogic concepts that are needed to stimulate interaction or to have a collaborative workplace training. A game idea usually is not developed from scratch because there is so much existing. Most games build upon what was already developed before. And as no model exists to predict how well a game idea will be received by the intended audience, the use of best practices is really crucial here. It's fundamental. One problem with serious games is that not as much experience has been gathered as with entertainment games. Therefore, we will present a few serious games that contain inspiring elements which could be used in the development of a serious game intended to stimulate the transformation of the digital transformation of government. So we come to the question, why can serious games help stimulate digital transformation? Well, we find some main issues or some main motivations. A first one is it's important to have the fun experience, to provide users with something that makes it enjoyable to use. And we have one example there intended for developing digital skills, the neo-cartographer. Another motivation is to generate curiosity and to motivate user participation. And we have also an example there, origami, that we will further discuss. A third motivation that is very important is to foster engagement, to evoke challenge, to increase empathy with different stakeholders, to help care for a specific environment. And then we have also one example, You Place It, that was also selected for this purpose. And in general, the serious games are used for higher goal achievement. And we also have one example there. This is only a selection of games. There is another one with which we will further elaborate in the end, which is the possibility to adapt and give feedback to the players on their different actions. So these are all serious games that were developed in the geospatial domain. There is one that comes more from security, where the only example that I found was in spoofing attacks. This is a domain where serious games have been used a lot because they allow to simulate a specific problem, such as an emergency, and test solving strategies. So there is no possibility to create a disaster, just to simulate a response. And I found one example there where basically some type of hacking was simulated on location elements in a game context. So if we go to the good practice examples, these are the games that were selected. The origami game is a game to stimulate spatial literacy. The You Place It is a game where the main goal is to stimulate or support negotiation and consensus building in urban planning. Neo-cartographer is a game to stimulate participation in crowdsourcing applications. Then the next one is teaching the GeoName design. That's mostly a spatial analysis and spatial literacy game. Then there are others that we did not go further analyze, but that are very good examples of cost-effective workflows by comparing different options. So game elements a game always consists of different game elements. And game elements are the critical features of a game. They are usually defined as those elements that have a direct impact on the outcome of the game and its results. The player is also given a mission, so there have to be clear goals and end conditions. There are some rules and barriers, so the game consists of overcoming some of these barriers. These are the challenges. They are usually given orally, verbally at the beginning of the game, or they are in the guidelines of the game. In order to keep it fun, there also has to be some probabilistic outcome, so some randomness. If everything can be predicted, the game will not be that exciting to play. And the player has to build some strategies to overcome the barriers. It's also important that the player is free to play whenever he wants to. So individual game elements must be linked to a specific behavior, motivation, attitudinal outcomes, which in turn must be linked to the learning outcomes, and that's the only way of having an effective game. So the game elements, they really are a combination of many different theories. So this is as far as I will go for the theoretical background. Then I will now go to the first practical example, the origami game. So it's a typical educative game where spatial literacy and competency is tested and stimulated. What is very inspiring here is how the game attempts to achieve different levels of spatial competence. So spatial issues are tested, challenges. There is the navigation, there is orientation, cartographic basics, so the map comprehension, the spatial learning, and basically the player, this is really for children, for learning how to read a map. So they get these challenges, and depending on how well they perform on one of the actions, they will get to a higher level or have additional support or alternative tests until they really are able to reach that level. What is also nice to see here is that it's very well documented what this game used as inspiration. So, for example, they also looked at what makes the success of City Poker, what makes the success of Geo-Tic-Tac. So they really looked at different games that are successful and then try to reuse some of these game elements. A very different type of game is this You Place It, which is a typical urban development type game that was developed in India, where different alternatives are combined and where the feasibility of an alternative for, in this case, a proposed road track is presented, and the different players can give information. The game starts with an expected value of the different properties along that road. And the negotiation box on the right side allows the player to input a price he or she is willing to pay for a property that is at a point tagged in green. And then the price negotiation can start. So they click on the negotiation button, which opens a panel, and the negotiation process can continue until the road planner agrees on the sale price proposed. So this is a very formal negotiation toolbox. There is also an informal chat box that is included for the player who tags the property and for the road planner. So it enables them to exchange informal messages in the form of free text. Now, this is also interesting because this type of informal chats tend to provide very interesting data that enable to better understand how the negotiation is done. So this is ultimately what is quantified, but this gives you the qualitative information to understand how the decisions were taken. So this is the You Place It negotiation game. Another example is this Neo-Cartographer. This is a game that was introduced to stimulate the updates in OpenStreetMap. So there was a problem that in some areas, everybody wanted to update the same map elements, while other areas were tended to be neglected. So they made this Neo-Cartographer game, which in its simplest version is a two-player game in which each player tries to be first to accomplish specific mapping tasks in a certain number of places shown by the game client software. Whoever maps a place first owns that place. So it's a very straightforward game, first visit, first allocation game. The main point of the game mechanic is to challenge the player to reason spatially. So the different places are not all equally interesting. And the worth of a place is determined by the size of the Voronoi cell. So in the standard playing mode, the boundary of the cell is not shown. So they have to decide which place they will move next. And then in the end, the winner is the one who has mapped most. So the winner gets more points. Now, a lesson learned from this neo-cartography is that advantages which do not accumulate are very frustrating. So it's important to have a good balance. Also, advantages which accumulate too fast are also very discouraging. So the developers monitored the player's behavior and used the player behavior to develop an agent-based model. And this agent-based model helped them to test new game mechanics. So such agent-based models can be useful. They can be a product by itself. They not only improve the game, but they also help to better understand how different stakeholders make their decisions and actions in the real world. So some lessons learned from these first examples is that serious games can contribute to location interoperability. We find the following issues most relevant: the knowledge sharing, issues of player skills, feedback, interaction, risk assessment, how to deal with uncertainty, imprecision and errors, adaptability, level of goals achievement, and multiplayer interaction. So stimulate multi-stakeholder interaction is definitely a very powerful outcome of this type of games. And geospatial competences in the domain, there is really a learning through play experience in all of the examples that we found. Now, the next question is how to prepare design and development of a serious game. The most important, and we will not go into much detail there, but it's crucial that design and development are always in collaboration. The first step is to define a very clear problem statement and to keep the design process focused on that problem statement. So in a serious game, there also must be at least one constraint given by the characterizing goal. So some rules to remember. First of all, it's important to define a clear problem statement in order to keep the design process and the process focused. When determining the target audience and investigating game elements attractive for that specific audience, the game designers should always keep in mind that the game is designed for the players, not for the game designers. And constant collaboration with experts, developers, target audience from the beginning of the design phase is really important to have a good focus on the design efforts. Now, another element that is important is that the content and the game mechanics should follow the same pace. So if a serious game is intended to stimulate or to support reflective thinking, it should be slow enough to allow for that thinking. On the other hand, if it's a game to stimulate or to test fast reaction, then of course it needs a fast-paced game. So these are really direct questions that follow once the objective of the game and the players are known. So another key question, or another set of key questions is, there is also a need to see how much supervision is needed. So should a game be accompanied by an instructor? Should it be played during leisure time or in a controlled environment? Is it the idea to play it just once? Or is it something repeatable? For example, a training application? And also a very important question that requires good pre-testing is how much time should be available for playing the game. Because when we use serious games, very often we are dealing with people that do not really have all that much time, so the game should be efficient and they should know in advance how much time it will require. So if we bring together the key aspects, we see that a game should be player-centered. It needs also to be tested and to be iterative. We see that the best games are those where every time it has been played, the information about how the players acted is collected and the game is improved. It requires some interdisciplinarity, and they should be, the different aspects should be integrated. So we use a serious game, but we get information from the serious game and monitor it. Then we develop new models, not only for the game, but also to better understand the domain knowledge. And then we can adapt the game and see how it can be used in a different context, reused in another, for another purpose. So we should consider a learning process by starting very simple and see how increasing complexity, where it will bring us. So this is a very nice example where from the GRC spatial exploration system, where we start with a very linear approach, and then we see how different tracks can be followed and how the complexity it can increase, and what this does to the possible outcomes of the game. Now, that does not mean that the task difficulty necessarily has to evolve from simple to complex. So it's a matter of balance between attractiveness and effectiveness, and this has to remain throughout the progression of the game. So it's important that whoever plays the game remains concentrated, feels control, faces goals, gets feedback, and that has to be the case at all the stages of the game. So the game, if it's in different stages, these different stages all need to be very well balanced in that regard. So the next example is the GRC scenario exploration game. In this game, the Foresight study had produced 4 scenarios describing possible transitions towards a sustainable future for Europe by 2035. Each scenario developed its own internal logic and coherence as to maximize diversity and perspectives. This figure presents the basic scenario logic. The objectives of the development of a serious game were use these scenarios to help players think systematically, make players discover and create alternative realistic futures, and build a novel stakeholder engagement platform applicable to a broad range of different topics. The main lesson here was that making the game itself was really a very valuable experience. Another issue to be considered is the game mastering, and especially if we want to reuse components of a game or game elements to build a new game, then we also need to think about what we are developing, how can this be used in different environments or for different purposes. In the case of the GRC SES game, there were 10 prototyping sessions. The players from different organizations really tested it and worked on had different sessions. And during all of the sessions, stories created and even players' notes were collected and were further used for further processing. So there was also a debriefing and further discussion after the game. So the game was just one part of the overall process. Now, adaptability not only allows to further improve the game, but it also is needed to facilitate reuse of the game elements. And what are important aspects for good adaptation found in this game, in these tests done, is that when using an iterative process to design a game, each version needs to be tested in the critical outcomes, how it helps to achieve the intended outcomes. So it's also very important to test each stage of the game. And as much as possible, feedback needs to be collected from the players. This is a board game, it's not an online game, so a lot of information that is collected automatically in an online game, such as what we saw in the You Place It chat box, when the choice is made to work for a board game, this has to be very systematically collected the traditional way. And then there is a requirement for multivariate testing. We don't just need to test if the game was interesting, if it was fun. We also need to test in how far the game really contributed to the objectives that were set at the beginning. The evaluation in the end was that most players enjoyed the way it helped them getting familiar in teaching about the scenarios. It also helps to concretize some abstract ideas that tend to be sometimes a little difficult to communicate in scenarios. And it helped to explore policy actions on a given topic. And the nice thing about doing that in a game context instead of in a real context is that it's a different setting. So it helps to think out of the box. Now, in the next example, we will look at some examples of dealing more with situational adaptation. This is an example from archaeology that was developed as a problem in order to resolve the problem that in many archaeological sites there is a lot of information, and when there are new developments they tend to work with augmented reality systems, but a lot of these augmented reality systems are just providing information in an innovative way, but it's not really stimulating interaction. So here the game was a treasure hunt to stimulate another way of experiencing the environment. The last example, is one that was from security field. It's a geolocation database that is used for sharing services. In this case, the game was developed for TV white space, 3.5 gigahertz spectrum band. And although providing accurate and reliable spectrum information services, the service suffers from security threats. So there is a possibility of hacking the system and bringing false location information, which gives some users an advantage. And so in this game, they simulated some attacks on the system to make it more secure and to avoid or to have scenarios on how to react and how to adapt, what penalties to give, and to develop a better surveillance strategy. The overall conclusion is that main issues to consider in order to maximize the benefits of gamification in the geospatial domain to stimulate digital transformation of government is, first of all, yes, serious games can contribute to key issues in the digital transformation of government and socio-technological developments. It can stimulate knowledge sharing, geospatial competence development, and so on. Making a game itself is a valuable experience, and there are many good practices in the geospatial domain which have game elements that are adaptable and can be further built on. Online games can add interactivity, but security threats are an additional issue to be dealt with in that case. So the recommendations, it's time to get started. If we want to develop a new game in the geospatial domain for e-government, this is the time to do it. There will be a lot of learning by doing, and it's important to start from what is already existing there. What we did not look at here was the standards and gamification in the geospatial domain, because there are a lot of standards in the geospatial domain, but there are also a lot of standards in gaming. So the overlap between these two are an aspect to be considered. So these are the questions that are open for discussion. What are the quick wins of gamification in the geospatial domain to stimulate digital transformation? Do we find other examples? And are there other issues that should be addressed? Now, after this presentation in January, a first test was done to see how a serious game could be used to develop a common vision among very different stakeholders. So the idea was to have a very simple pre-test of in what way this overall concept that we have in the GRC scenario exploration game, how it could be used and adapted for a different purpose. And this was a student project that was finished just this week and presented to the jury this Wednesday. What the students did was in a municipality near the Dutch and German border in Belgium. There was an idea that the mayor basically would like to develop health tourism in the municipality. And there are a number of different potential stakeholders that could be involved with it, but they know they are doing something related to health tourism, but the idea of the serious game is, can we stimulate a common vision? So they started with an inventory of the entire area, of what are the potential assets. They did interviews, and then they developed personas that could participate in the game, that would be needed to participate in the game. So of course you have the hotels and restaurants, but there is also a nature park, there is a harbor, there are the cycling trails. So the different stakeholders were identified, and what was interesting was the way it was approached. So first there was a desk research on serious games and on health tourism. Then there was a kickoff meeting with a site visit. There was an opportunity for the students to participate in games with a a consultancy company that does nothing but develop serious games. So they did a first, just an observation. Based on that, they went back and they looked into what this would mean in terms of the objective of the game and how to set up the game. Then they had this complete inventory of the supply and preliminary interviews with the stakeholders. So, and the stakeholder analysis, basically all these steps were the steps needed to set the scene and to understand how to start developing the games. So understand what the needs are, what the purpose is, what the assets are. Then based on that, the serious game was developed. There was a first pre-test, it was adapted again, and then it was, they played the game with the different, with at least one stakeholder representing each of the personas that they had prepared the game for. It was a little similar to the GRC SES, that it was a three-stage game. So the first is the discovery phase, where everybody presents what they are doing, but also not only what they are doing, but what they expect of the game and what they expect in terms of health tourism. So this basically is a moment where it's more than a tour de table, it's a first presentation, and the other players can react on what each of them says. So this is used to make a little representation of what this stakeholder stands for in terms of tourism. Then the second phase is the phase of imagination. And there, based on some ideas that came from the interviews, each stakeholder could take turns, and they take one card, they draw one card with a statement, and then they start discussing what they would be, what they would do in case this would happen. And then there is a rule where first two stakeholders discuss, and then the next one discusses on what the previous has done, and in the end, the first stakeholder can react again. And this stakeholder then picks the most appropriate cards from the other stakeholders that fit best with his or her idea. Then we have the result is that each stakeholder then has a lot of complementary information and feedback from the others. Then we have an intermediate step, the bigger picture, where all the cards are brought together and where questions are asked about what is the goal and how would this go into the future. And then the last phase is to evaluate and to take out the key elements of the strategy and turn that into a common vision. The lessons learned. Most of what was from what I said in the presentation before were the positive and negative points that we also found here. So yes, the game did contribute to more empathy, more understanding, and to the development of a shared vision. There is a risk of false expectations. So it's something to be monitored, that the thinking out of the box doesn't get us too far from a realistic result. And it does help to set the first contours of a common strategy, a common vision, but in one game it was not possible to focus and also address some more detailed elements. So overall, the participants and the municipality were very happy about it. They were convinced that it did improve the communication among the stakeholders and that they would do it again in the future. Now, one of the main challenges is the pace of the game. The game took too long. They had to shorten it and to adapt it while playing. And another important aspect is to keep the focus on the goals of the game. So avoid, it's linked with the false expectations, but avoid that people go home with the idea that this was a fun 2 hours, but the goal needs to be achieved as well. So that concludes the presentation. I now leave the floor to Robin.
Well, thanks very much, Therese. As I said at the beginning, I felt this always was an important piece of work by able to give us at least to start to reflect about what it means really to use games in a digital transformation context and to draw on the aspects that relate to geospatial in particular, and you've certainly done that. It's a number of very important questions that you've raised in the context of the presentation on many levels. I really appreciate, of course, the theoretical aspects that you put in here. I want to be able to ground the discussion in some of these theory, and just as one note of reflection, the social construction aspects that are mentioned in one of your tables, these are something that go in to talk about how technology is adapted and adopted in lots of different contexts. So I very much appreciate that link, because a lot of what we do seems to look at the technology and the possibilities of data, whereas we're actually exposing a lot of arguments that are important about how technology is really used, especially in a government context and especially in the context of government, let's say, changing in response to technology through digital transformation. And I think the other really important aspect is you've added now some practical experience of doing it. It's something that we wanted to take forward too. And it's an opportunity of having made this recording to also update on your practical experience and something to reflect on for all of us. And I just want to close with one other very quick comment here. One of the key notions and leading purposes of the ISA² program is about sharing and reuse. And I think it's also really interesting to discuss later about the aspects that relate to reusing a game and how game mechanics actually have some reusability, and you've also touched upon that in the presentation. So I think there's something in this topic that actually helps us look at existing problems in a slightly different way, and in that context also trying to help people to get new types of solutions to various problems. So again, very much thanks from me. I'm really pleased that we're able to have this update, and I look forward to further discussion. I propose therefore to stop the recording now, and we can chat a little more about some of the issues that Therese has raised. Thanks again.